So, back in 2024, the National Assessment of Educational Progress released this piece of data that is just, well, it's staggering.
Yeah, truly sobering.
Right. It showed that only 16% of Black fourth graders in the U.S. had reached reading proficiency. And, if you're hearing that for the first time, your immediate human instinct is probably to ask, like, how is the system failing this badly?
Exactly. You assume it's a failure.
Right. But the two monumental texts we're diving into today, they completely flip that question on its head. They ask a much more uncomfortable question, which is, what if the system isn't failing at all? Like, what if it's functioning exactly as it was historically designed to?
And that is the exact paradigm shift we are unpacking today. We're doing a deep dive into this incredibly comprehensive analysis of how communities move from, just surviving within systems to holding actual, tangible, measurable power.
Measurable power, I like that.
Right, over their own destinies. And to really get this, we're looking at two foundational blueprints, but through a very specific academic and cultural lens.
Yeah, and we really need to set the stage for you here because the lens itself is just fascinating. The stack of notes we're working from comes from Jimma Maat Dogon McWilson.
Yes.
And he's a master's student of Kemetic Africology at the African World Exploratory University, or AWE.
Yeah.
But before we go any further, when I first read these notes, I realized I needed a working definition of Kemetic Africology.
It's a great question.
Like, what exactly does that mean in this academic context?
It's a crucial starting point, honestly. So Kemetic refers to Kemet, which is the original ancient name for Egypt.
Okay.
And Africology is basically the Afrocentric study of, phenomena, events, ideas, and personalities related to Africa. So when you put them together, Kemetic Africology is essentially this academic discipline where you analyze modern socioeconomic and political issues, but you use the foundational philosophical and spiritual frameworks of ancient Africa.
So it's an internal perspective.
Exactly. It's grounded. Rather than analyzing Black communities exclusively through like a Eurocentric or external sociological lens, it centers the analysis entirely from within.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And it perfectly explains the visual branding of the documents we received from AWE.
Oh, the logo.
Yeah, the analysis prominently features this incredibly striking logo. It has an Ankh symbol right in the center.
The ancient Egyptian symbol of life.
Right, surrounded by the university's name. But what really anchors it, I think, is the color scheme. It uses the Pan-African colors, red, black, green, and yellow.
Yeah, it's very intentional.
It is. It immediately tells you that we are looking at these issues from a deeply rooted global Black perspective. It's like a visual declaration of independence before you even read the first page.
That visual anchoring is vital, really. It sets the tone for the two massive texts Jimma Maat Dogon McWilson is analyzing. So the first one is Theodore Cross's The Black Power Imperative,
which was first printed back in 1984.
Right. And the second is Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power, which is this massive, 889-page volume published in 1998.
A literal textbook.
Pretty much. These are heavy, foundational, utterly uncompromising works of political and economic theory.
Absolute titans in this space. So what's our mission for you today? We are going to contrast these two landmark works. We'll want to identify exactly where Cross and Wilson's philosophies align and where they fundamentally diverge.
Because they definitely diverge.
Oh, massively. Especially in their approach to solving these disparities. But we aren't just doing a historical book report here. The ultimate goal for this deep dive is to fuse their ideas together to build a proactive, asset-based, positive action plan.
Exactly.
We want to give you a tangible toolkit for local institution building and measurable progress.
Now, I want to pause here for a second because as we map out this toolkit, we are going to, bump up against some very heavy, highly contemporary political debates.
For sure.
The texts explicitly discuss strategies for countering things like modern anti-DEI laws or pushing back against public school curriculum censorship and using federal civil rights legislation. So just a quick reminder for everyone listening. Our job today isn't to take a political side on those specific policies.
Right. We're not doing that.
We aren't here to endorse a right-wing or a left-wing legislative agenda. Our role as impartial guides is just to map out exactly what Theodore Cross and Amos Wilson are advising their readers to do.
We're dissecting the mechanics.
Exactly. We're looking at their arguments and action plans, not taking a political stance of our own.
I'm really glad you laid that out because these guys pull no punches.
No, they do not.
We're just here to trace the blueprints. So let's start with the foundation. Before we can look at how Cross and Wilson differ in their actual strategies, we really have to establish their core point of agreement. Because despite writing 14 years apart and having very different professional backgrounds, they completely align on one absolute necessity. A community has to completely abandon the goal of seeking access and shift entirely to building power.
That shift, from access to power, it is the heartbeat of both documents.
Yeah.
If we don't understand the mechanical difference between those two concepts, the rest of their blueprints will just sound like abstract theory.
I was actually trying to think of a way to visualize the mechanics of this for you. And it's essentially the difference between being handed a key to a house that someone else built versus, holding the deed.
Holding the deed, yeah.
Right, holding the deed, owning the construction equipment, and deciding how the foundation is actually laid. Access is getting the key. Power is owning the property.
Let's push that analogy a bit further, actually, because it's highly accurate.
Mm-hmm.
If you only have the key, the person who actually owns the house can change the locks at any moment.
Oh, that's a great point.
They can turn off the water. They can decide you just aren't welcome anymore. You are entirely dependent on their goodwill, their mood, their political climate. Access is inherently conditional.
Conditional, yes.
But power is structural. Let's look at how Theodore Cross defines the systemic reality that makes this shift to power so vital. Cross argues that racism isn't just, a matter of personal prejudice or individual bias.
Or someone just using a slur.
Exactly. He defines it mechanically as a system of accumulated advantage.
Accumulated advantage. I love that phrasing. It's so deliberate. It really makes me think of, compound interest in finance, but applied to sociology.
That is exactly how Cross intends it to be understood. He points out that historical advantages in land ownership, capital accumulation, access to specialized jobs, control of the courts, control of the banks, it means the starting line was just never equal.
Never.
Think about the mechanics. If one group benefits from centuries of free labor, and that's followed by racially exclusive housing policies like redlining.
Right, and then unequal access to the GI Bill after World War II.
Exactly. That wealth and structural positioning compounds generation after generation.
Right, so Cross is essentially saying, look, we're currently being told to compete in the free market as if the starting line is equal, but the track itself, the stadium, and the referees are all owned by the other runners.
Precisely. Because one group was legally and economically positioned at the bottom, and another group had centuries to accumulate institutional control. Cross argues that relying on moral appeals or temporary charity is completely insufficient.
It's not enough.
No, you cannot bridge a multi-generational gap of accumulated structural advantage with a temporary social program. Or a plea for empathy. Empathy doesn't transfer deeds.
Empathy doesn't transfer deeds.
Wow.
And this is where Amos Wilson's perspective slots in perfectly to show their alignment. Wilson defines black power, and he's very explicit in his text that he's not talking about mere anger or marching or even just cultural pride.
Right.
He defines power as a concrete capacity.
Concrete capacity is definitely the operational term there. How does Wilson break that down in the text?
He gets incredibly pragmatic. Wilson says power is the actual capacity to define reality, to protect a community physically and economically, to control resources, to reward your allies, and to build institutions.
Yes.
It's not just an emotional state of feeling empowered, It is a structural reality. You have to be able to shape the future, and frankly, you have to be able to politically or economically punish betrayal.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, both authors arrive at the exact same conclusion regarding civil rights. They both agree that rights without enforcement mechanisms are just, they're empty promises.
Right.
Think about the mechanics of that for a second. You can have a civil right written on a piece of paper, but if you don't have the institutional power to enforce that right in a courtroom or leverage it in a boardroom, it is merely a suggestion.
They also agree that symbolic representation without accountability is a total illusion.
Oh, absolutely.
Like just having a politician or a corporate executive who looks like you in a seat of power doesn't mean anything if that person isn't structurally accountable to an organized community agenda.
If they're only accountable to the system of accumulated advantage that hired them.
Exactly. then their representation is useless to the community.
You should really note here that both men view dependency on external systems as the ultimate vulnerability.
Yeah.
Cross sees this dependency through the lens of economic and legal vulnerability, like you're at the mercy of their banks and their courts.
Right.
Wilson sees it as a threat to psychological and physical survival itself,
Right.
but the core alignment is absolute. Dependency is dangerous, access is a trap, and organized independent power is the only way to secure a community's future.
Okay, so we've established that they both agree on the need for power.
Yeah.
The key to the house isn't enough. You need the deed.
Right.
But here's where it gets incredibly fascinating. How do you actually get the deed when you've been historically locked out of the bank?
That is the question.
Because this is where the conversation really pivots. When we look at their actual blueprints for achieving that power, Cross and Wilson take fundamentally different approaches.
They do. They represent two entirely different strategic methodologies for community empowerment. Let's start by unpacking Theodore Cross. If we're giving them titles, I kind of look at his approach as the data-driven auditor.
The auditor. I love that. And it makes perfect sense given his background. For context, Theodore Cross was the founder and editor of the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education.
Yes, he was.
So this is a man who lived and breathed data, institutional metrics, and publishing cold, hard facts. He wasn't some philosopher in the clouds. He was a spreadsheet guy.
Exactly. And because of that background, Cross's entire strategy focuses on quantifiable metrics to force system accountability. He doesn't just want to talk philosophically about inequality,
Right.
He wants to measure it, publish it, compare it across institutions, and use those numbers to create undeniable legal and public pressure.
And Jimma Maat's analysis of Cross brings in some very specific, really jarring contemporary data to illustrate why Cross's 1984 methodology is still relevant today.
Very relevant.
We're looking at recent census data showing 18.4% of Black Americans living below the official poverty line. That is more than double the rate for non-Hispanic white Americans.
And the analysis also highlights unemployment data projected out to April 2026. It notes a 7.3% unemployment rate for Black Americans compared to a 4.3% overall national rate.
Wow.
So Cross's philosophy looks at these numbers and says, these are not accidents, they aren't random fluctuations of the market, and they're certainly not evidence of personal or cultural failure.
Right. They're the measurable, logical outcomes of that accumulated advantage system functioning exactly as intended.
Precisely. So Cross looks at those numbers, and his strategy is to mount external pressure. He wants to audit the existing system.
Make them answer for it.
Yeah. He argues that you have to convert this pain and disparity into actionable bureaucratic items. You convert it into policy changes, municipal budget reallocations, aggressive litigation, and federal civil rights complaints.
So he essentially wants to use the system's own rules, its own laws, and its own metrics to force it to yield power and resources back to the community.
Right. Cross is saying, we will measure your institutions, we will publicly grade you on your outcomes, and if you fall short of equitable distribution, we will sue you or legislate you into compliance.
Wow.
It is a highly external, confrontational, legal, and political strategy. Now contrast that with Amos N. Wilson.
Okay.
If Cross is the data-driven auditor, Wilson is the cultural architect.
Cultural architect. And Wilson's work is staggering in its scope. I mean, Blueprint for Black Power is roughly 889 pages.
It's huge.
It's described in Jimma Maat's text as a literal master plan for survival and empowerment in the 21st century. But Wilson isn't starting with census data and lawsuits. He's starting with psychology, morality, and culture.
And this is a profound divergence in their thinking. Wilson believes that you cannot build lasting political or economic power if your psychological and cultural foundation is fractured.
That makes sense.
Right. You can't just fight the system legally if your mind has been colonized by that same system. So Jimma Maat's analysis connects Wilson's architectural strategy directly to the ancient African principles of Maat.
Okay, we really need to unpack this for the listener
Yeah.
because the concept of Maat is central to understanding Wilson's blueprint. The notes break down these principles beautifully. There are 6 key principles mentioned here: truth, justice, balance, order, reciprocity, and righteousness.
Yes.
And Wilson maps these ancient concepts directly onto modern pragmatic power building. But how does an ancient Egyptian philosophy translate into a modern blueprint? Like, what does that look like?
Let's walk through them mechanically. In Wilson's framework, truth isn't just about, not telling lies. It means teaching history and current reality honestly to your children, stripping away the myths of the dominant culture.
Oh, I see.
Justice means actively repairing historical and present harm within your own community, not just waiting for the courts to do it for you.
Okay.
Balance is about restoring the family unit, ensuring culture, economics, and education are brought into harmony rather than competing with each other.
That makes a lot of sense. And then you have order, which Jimma Maat notes is absolutely crucial for Wilson.
Really crucial.
Order means building highly disciplined organizations. Wilson says unity isn't enough, right? Like people can be united in anger and achieve absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
Unity has to be tied to strategy, structure, and discipline. Then there's reciprocity. How does reciprocity work mechanically?
So reciprocity is the economic and social engine. It requires that institutions actually serve the people who fund them.
Okay.
If a community spends its money at a local business, reciprocity demands that business hires from the community and invests its profits back into local infrastructure.
So it's a closed-loop system of mutual benefit.
Exactly. And finally, righteousness, which Wilson frames as putting the survival and elevation of children and the community way above individual selfish ambition.
So, looking at that Maat framework, Wilson's strategy is entirely about internal capacity. He believes that true power is generated from within. It's deeply connected to spiritual and cultural identity.
Yes.
His blueprint is about building completely independent systems. He wants independent schools, independent banks, independent food supply chains, so that the community doesn't have to rely on external, historically hostile systems at all.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to push back on this because reading through an 889-page master plan for total independence sounds incredible in theory, but is it actually realistic?
A fair question.
Like, is Amos Wilson seriously suggesting that a working-class community today can completely abandon the public school system and the traditional banking system and just build a completely independent ecosystem from the ground up? How do parents working two jobs have the time or capital for that?
That is the exact friction point that makes Wilson's work so demanding. Wilson isn't arguing that it will be easy. He is arguing that it is a matter of absolute survival.
Survival.
Yes. He looks at the system of accumulated advantage and concludes that trying to reform it from the inside is a fool's errand. It will always recalibrate to protect itself.
Right.
So to answer your question, Wilson doesn't expect this to happen overnight. It requires pooling minimal resources, extreme discipline, and starting small. Like a weekend study group that eventually pools capital to buy a building, which eventually becomes a full-time school.
I see.
He sees independence not as a luxury preference, but as an absolute non-negotiable necessity to stop the hemorrhaging of community resources.
Okay, that clarifies it a lot. He views it as a multi-generational project.
So, synthesizing this, Cross wants to audit the existing system with a clipboard, point at the disparities with hard data, and demand what is owed through litigation and policy extraction.
Right.
Meanwhile, Wilson essentially wants to turn his back on the existing system, lay new bricks based on Malad, and build a completely independent ecosystem. Yes, that tension between aggressive external reform of the existing system and the creation of absolute internal independence from it, that is the crux of their divergence. Cross is looking outward to extract power. Wilson is looking inward to generate power.
And as I'm looking at our notes, these two diverging methodologies, the external auditor and the internal architect, they don't just exist in abstract theory.
No, they don't.
They collide in a very real, very tangible way in one specific critical arena.
They absolutely do. And that arena is education.
Yes.
If you want to see where the battle between external accountability and internal independence plays out most fiercely, you look at the classroom. Education is the ultimate battleground for the mind.
Let's start with Cross's systemic critique of the educational system. And here is where we bring back that sobering data point I mentioned at the very beginning.
The NAEP data.
Right. The Jimma Maat analysis points to the 2024 NAEP result, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Only 16% of Black fourth graders reach reading proficiency.
16%. When you hear a metric like that, Cross's methodology demands that we fundamentally change our vocabulary. We are conditioned to look at that number and call it a Black failure, or at best, an achievement gap.
Exactly. And Cross violently rejects the phrase achievement gap. He argues that placing the word achievement next to the word gap subtly places the blame on the student's lack of effort.
Yes, it shifts the blame.
The analysis states clearly that this is not an achievement gap. It is a, and I'm quoting here, power gap, a curriculum gap, an expectation gap, and a profound institutional responsibility gap.
Mechanically, how does Cross explain that? If racism is a system of accumulated advantage, then an educational system that produces a 16% proficiency rate is not broken.
Right.
It is functioning exactly as it was historically designed to function. It's actively preserving the advantage of the incumbent class by ensuring the next generation of the marginalized class lacks the basic literacy to compete or wield power.
So Cross's solution, playing his role as the relentless auditor, is to demand public scorecards.
Scorecards. Yes.
He wants school districts and even Black-led institutions like civil rights groups and local churches to be measured by these exact educational outcomes. He wants parents to take these scorecards to school board meetings, file federal Title VI civil rights complaints for disparate impact, and legally force the public schools to deliver what taxpayer dollars fund them to deliver.
He wants to sue the school into competence.
Literally sue them into competence.
Now, let's pivot to Wilson's consciousness critique of education. Wilson takes a much more existential psychological view. He argues that education does not just transfer information, it fundamentally controls consciousness.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the public education system isn't just failing to teach reading, it is actively shaping a reality where the child accepts their subservient position.
The text notes Wilson's stance perfectly here. If an education system forces a child to forget their ancestors, or subtly teaches them through a mission that their people contributed nothing to history, then that education is actually a psychological weapon. It's manufacturing failure, destroying self-esteem, and then blaming the children for their resulting disengagement.
Wilson believes you cannot send your children to an institution designed by a system of accumulated advantage and expect those children to be taught the skills required to dismantle that advantage.
It makes no sense.
It's a logical contradiction. Why would the system train its own replacements? So Wilson advocates for independent systems. He pushes for parent-controlled learning circles, independent Saturday schools, and African-centered rites of passage.
Okay, break down rites of passage for me, because that sounds deeply cultural, but how does it function mechanically as an educational tool?
Mechanically, a rite of passage is a structured, intentional psychological transition. In Wilson's framework, you don't just hope a teenager becomes a responsible adult.
Right, you don't just leave it to chance.
Exactly. You take them through a rigorous curriculum, often spanning months or years, where they learn their history, their civic responsibilities, financial literacy, and community defense. They have to prove their mastery of these subjects to the elders of the community. It is a mechanism for ensuring that every young person is intentionally programmed with the values of Maat before they take on adult responsibilities. It completely bypasses the ideological constraints and lowered expectations of the public school system.
Here's what I find fascinating, though, despite coming at this from totally opposing angles.
Yeah.
Cross wanting to sue the public school into shape using federal law, and Wilson wanting to build a new school entirely based on ancient principles. They share an identical, uncompromising standard for the students themselves.
Yes, they do. They both utterly reject the idea of minimum proficiency.
Right.
They don't want kids to just barely pass a standardized state test. The mutual goal, stated explicitly in the Jimma Maat analysis, is mastery.
Mastery. Moving children from mere survival in a hostile system to the absolute mastery of themselves and their environment. Whether you are using Cross's public school scorecard to demand AP classes or Wilson's independent Saturday school to teach Kemetic history, the expectation is absolute excellence in reading, math, science, economics, and law. There is no room for victimhood in their academic standards.
And this is another good moment to remind our listeners about the contemporary context of this analysis. The texts we are studying strongly advocate for challenging what they term anti-Black curriculum erasure, book bans, and anti-DEI laws.
Right. Very relevant today.
The authors view these modern policies not just as political maneuvers, but as direct mechanical threats to educational mastery and cultural identity. As impartial guides, we are detailing how Cross and Wilson advise communities to legally and politically push back against these specific policies to protect their power. We are mapping their defensive strategy, not jumping into the political fray ourselves.
Absolutely. We're just outlining the architecture of their response. And if education is the battleground for the mind, we have to ask the next logical question. How do Cross and Wilson address the material world?
The physical reality.
Right. How do we move from shaping consciousness in the classroom to actually wielding power at the bank and the ballot box?
This brings us to the economic and political realities of their blueprints. And again, we see this fascinating interplay between Wilson's internal focus and Cross's external focus. Let's look at Wilson's economic imperative first.
Okay.
Wilson insists, fundamentally, that a community must move from a consumer mindset to an ownership mindset.
Right, because if you are purely a consumer class, you're just a battery enriching someone else's accumulated advantage.
That's a great way to put it.
You go to work, you earn a paycheck, and you immediately hand it back to corporations outside your community. The vital question Wilson asks, and this is a brilliant metric to keep in your head, is how much black money circulates through black institutions before leaving the community?
The velocity and circulation of a dollar is the true definition of economic power. Economists call this the multiplier effect.
The multiplier effect.
Right. If a dollar comes into a community and immediately leaves to pay an absentee landlord, or buys groceries from a multinational conglomerate with no local ties, that dollar didn't build power, it just passed through.
It was just visiting.
Exactly, it had a multiplier of 0. But if you spend that dollar at a local grocery store, and that store owner uses it to pay a local accountant, and that accountant uses it to pay a local tutor, that $1 has done the work of $3.
So Wilson's economic solutions are all about capturing that dollar and forcing it to circulate. The text lists specific mechanisms: community investment funds, black credit unions, lending circles, land trusts, and buy black procurement systems.
Let's take a credit union as an example of a mechanism.
Yeah.
A traditional bank takes deposits from a marginalized community and frequently lends that capital out to developers in wealthier areas.
Absolutely.
A community-owned credit union traps that capital. The deposits of the community are pooled and explicitly used to give low-interest loans to local businesses and home buyers within that exact same community. It is building an economic wall around the community so the wealth can compound internally.
Now compare that with Theodore Cross's phase of political and legal power. Cross recognizes that internal economics are vital, but he points out that you still exist within a broader state apparatus.
You do.
You still have to deal with the federal government, the city council, and the police department. So his focus is on external political enforcement.
And it is vital to note that for Cross, political power is not just about the act of voting. We often stop and go out and vote. Cross is asking the mechanical question: what does the vote extract?
I love how he frames that. Voting without an organized, measurable agenda is just symbolic participation. You get an I voted sticker, but you don't get a new community center. Cross emphasizes the mechanics of extraction. He wants communities filing Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, public records requests to see exactly where the city budget is going.
Follow the money.
Always. He wants to file civil rights complaints when municipal funding for roads and schools is disproportionate. And he wants relentless, coordinated testimony at every single school board and city council meeting. He wants to leverage political participation to literally force the state to yield resources.
You know, as I'm picturing these two approaches, I'm imagining a medieval castle. Am I off base here?
The castle. I like it. Go on.
Well, Wilson is inside the walls, building the internal economic engine. He's setting up the agricultural cooperatives, the local directories, the credit unions, making sure the people inside are fed, educated, and completely self-sustaining.
That is a perfect visualization.
Yeah.
And Cross is on the battlements, building the external defensive shield. He's handling the litigation, the voter education, the civil rights complaints, making sure the external forces, the hostile state actors, don't breach the walls or cut off the water supply through discriminatory zoning laws.
You need both. An internal engine without an external shield is vulnerable to policy attacks. The city council could just zone your independent school out of existence.
Oh, absolutely.
But an external shield without an internal engine means you are defending an empty fortress. You might win a lawsuit, but your people are still starving.
That realization that you need both the internal builder and the external auditor brings us to the absolute core mission of this deep dive. It is time to deliver on what we promised you at the start.
Yes, the action plan.
We're going to take these immense philosophies from Cross and Wilson and the analysis of Jimma Maat Dogon McWilson and fuse them into one concrete, proactive, asset-based action plan for local power.
This is where the 889-page theory becomes a weekend toolkit. The analysis breaks this down into 5 distinct phases of local institution building. These are concrete, mechanical steps a community can take to move from access to power.
Let's go through them step by step, explaining exactly how they function.
Sounds good. Let's start with step 1.
Step 1 is deeply rooted in Wilson's philosophy. Community study circles. You don't start by just throwing money at a problem or protesting. You start with consciousness and study.
Right.
The text suggests organizing 12-week curriculums for small groups of neighbors. They sit down and study Black power, the principles of Maat, African history, and they rigorously analyze historical and modern policy.
The mechanical logic here is brilliant. You cannot organize a community that does not share a common vocabulary, a common understanding of its history, and a common set of objectives.
Right, they just argue.
Exactly. If everyone has a different definition of the problem, the organization will splinter. The study circles create the ideological glue. It ensures that when the group finally takes action, they are acting from a place of deeply shared strategy, not just reacting emotionally to the latest news cycle outrage.
Which leads right into step 2, which pulls heavily from Cross. Building Black student academic power centers. Notice the word power there.
Yeah,
These aren't just casual after-school homework clubs where kids eat snacks. These are highly structured local hubs, relentlessly focused on reading and math mastery, writing, history, science, and crucially, parent self-training.
That parent training is the key mechanism. You cannot just drop your child off and hope for the best. The center trains the parents to be the primary advocates and educators for their children, teaching them how to navigate IEP meetings, how to demand advanced coursework, and how to supplement the public school curriculum at home.
It shifts the locus of control back to the family unit. Step 3 expands on this, leaning back into Wilson's architectural mind. Independent educational ecosystems. This is moving beyond just supplementing the public school.
Going further.
Yeah, this is creating parent-controlled learning circles, establishing fully independent Saturday schools, and building robust tutoring networks. It is creating a physical and intellectual environment where the curriculum is controlled 100% by the community, entirely free from external censorship, book bans, or lowered expectations.
Once the mind is trained, we move to step 4, where Cross and Wilson's ideas truly merge into material reality, economic cooperatives, because those independent schools and power centers need funding to survive.
They sure do.
This step involves establishing local business directories so people know exactly where to intentionally spend their money. It involves creating community investment clubs where 50 neighbors put in $50 a month to pool capital. And it means launching youth entrepreneurship programs so the next generation is trained in business ownership, not just how to write a resume for an employer.
It's the circulation of the dollar in action. And finally, step 5, which is pure Theodore Cross, independent civil rights task forces. As you build this internal power, you will inevitably face external friction from the system.
Always.
This step means building local legal defense networks. You need legally trained individuals ready to handle school board testimonies, file Title VI civil rights complaints locally, and challenge discriminatory municipal policies using the courts.
So that is the institution building side. But remember, the core tenet of Theodore Cross, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it.
Right.
The action plan demands measurable ways to track progress. You cannot just assume things are getting better. You need scorecards to hold both external systems and your own internal leadership accountable.
Okay, let's detail these scorecards because this is where the rubber meets the road for anyone trying to implement this. First, the education scorecard. The Jimma Maat text details the exact metrics Cross demands we track.
It's very specific.
We aren't just asking if the school feels welcoming or has a diverse poster on the wall. We are measuring hard data. Black reading proficiency by grade level, math proficiency, suspension and expulsion rates broken down by race, access to advanced placement and STEM courses, the specific numbers on Black teacher recruitment and retention, and hard data on college and career outcomes post-graduation.
And critically, that data must be published widely within the community and used as a weapon of accountability at school board meetings. Next is the political scorecard, which brings in Wilson's metrics of extraction.
Okay.
This is not just a list of who got elected or voter turnout percentages. A political scorecard requires tracking whether candidates signed concrete accountability pledges based on a specific Black community agenda.
Nice.
It measures the specific implementation of policy platforms. It asks the mechanical question, did the politician we mobilized to elect actually deliver the structural budget changes we demanded, or did they just give a nice speech?
And finally, the economic tracker. This measures the success of those monthly Buy Black campaigns and the velocity of the dollar. But it goes deeper than just individual consumers buying coffee at a local shop.
Much deeper.
It rigorously tracks the procurement policies of massive local institutions. Where are the local nonprofits, the megachurches, the fraternities, and the sororities spending their massive annual budgets? Are they using Black-owned caterers, accountants, banks, and construction contractors? Or are they taking community donations and handing them over to outside corporations?
If you put all of this together, the consciousness-raising study circles, the rigorous academic power centers, the wealth-building economic cooperatives, the defensive legal task forces, and these ruthless, data-driven scorecards, you have a comprehensive mechanical blueprint for total societal transformation.
This is so incredibly empowering, and I want to connect this directly back to you listening right now. Whether you're tuning in because you're prepping for a leadership role in your neighborhood association, or maybe you're just insanely curious and trying to understand the invisible mechanical gears of how societal power actually functions, this blueprint is a masterclass.
It really is.
It proves that true, lasting progress is not a mystery. It requires both the internal building and cultural grounding of Amos Wilson, paired with a relentless external accountability and data-driven auditing of Theodore Cross. You simply cannot have one without the other if you want to survive.
It is a profound, necessary duality. It removes the emotion and replaces it with structure. But as we wrap up this massive deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
I love a good final thought.
Both of these brilliant authors urge us to tirelessly measure our institutions, to circulate our wealth internally, and to relentlessly demand accountability from the outside world. But if these blueprints are followed to their ultimate logical conclusion over the next few generations, it raises an important philosophical question.
Okay.
Is the truest metric of a community's power not what it can successfully demand from others, but what it eventually no longer needs to ask for at all?